Hello everyone. Before we enter into the detailed story, characters, acts, and scenes of Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield, let us first understand what the title page itself is telling us. The title of our work is The Vicar of Wakefield, written by Oliver Goldsmith. First, let us understand the word vicar. A vicar is a Christian clergyman or parish priest who has responsibility for a particular parish. So, when we hear the title The Vicar of Wakefield, we should immediately understand that the central character is a religious man who serves a community. The word Wakefield refers to the place with which this vicar is associated. Therefore, the title essentially means the story of the parish priest of Wakefield. But there is an important point for examination purposes. The novel is not simply the story of a priest doing his religious duties. It is the story of his family, his values, his happiness, his suffering, his mistakes, and the many unexpected events that test his character. The author is Oliver Goldsmith, one of the important literary figures of the 18th century. Goldsmith was an Irish-born writer who became an important figure in English literature. He is remembered for both poetry and prose, and especially for works such as The Vicar of Wakefield and the comedy She Stoops to Conquer. Now look carefully at the subtitle on our slide, a detailed act-wise and scene-wise analysis. This tells us exactly how we are going to study this work. Instead of simply reading the story from beginning to end, we are going to divide it into smaller parts and understand what happens at each important stage. Think of the novel like a long journey. If someone tells you, "I traveled a very long distance," you may understand the general idea, but you will not know exactly where the person stopped, what happened at each place, or how the journey changed. In the same way, an act-wise and scene-wise approach helps us stop at important moments and understand what happens, why it happens, who is involved, and what Goldsmith is trying to show us. The ship's wheel shown on the title page is also an interesting visual symbol. A wheel suggests movement, direction, and changes in fortune. And that idea is very important to this novel because the life of the central family does not remain stable. Their circumstances change repeatedly, moving from happiness to difficulty, from hope to disappointment, and eventually toward resolution. So, as we begin this lesson, remember three things. The vicar is our central figure. Wakefield identifies the setting associated with him. And Goldsmith uses the family's changing experiences to explore human nature, family values, morality, society, deception, suffering, and ultimately resilience. By the end of our detailed study, you should not merely remember the events of the novel. You should understand why each important event happens and what it tells us about Goldsmith and 18th century society. Now, with that foundation, let us move into the story and begin our detailed analysis. Now let us begin with the general introduction to The Vicar of Wakefield. Before we enter the story, we need to understand three important things: when the novel was published, what literary period it belongs to, and the fascinating story behind its publication. First, look at the left side of the slide. It says, "The Victorian Favourite, born in the Enlightenment." There is an important correction we should make here for examination purposes. The Vicar of Wakefield is not a Victorian novel. It was published in 1766, during the 18th century, in the Age of the Enlightenment. The Victorian period begins much later, in 1837. So why does the slide call it a Victorian favourite? Because although the novel was written and published in the 18th century, it continued to be extremely popular during the Victorian period. In fact, it became one of the books that Victorian readers and writers continued to read and refer to. So remember this distinction very carefully. Written and published in the 18th century. Popular well beyond the 18th century, including the Victorian age. This is an excellent examination trap. Now, The Vicar of Wakefield is especially important because it is Oliver Goldsmith's only novel. Goldsmith wrote poetry, essays, drama, and other prose, but The Vicar of Wakefield is his only novel. The first edition appeared in 1766. The title of the original work is The Vicar of Wakefield, Our Tale, supposed to be written by himself. It was printed in 2 volumes. Now let us understand the phrase, born in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that placed great importance on reason, observation, criticism, and human understanding. But here we have something interesting. Goldsmith does not simply write a cold, intellectual novel based on reason. Instead, he gives us family affection, morality, religion, emotion, suffering, comedy, deception, and human weakness. That mixture is one reason the novel remains interesting. Now let us move to the right side of the slide, because this is one of the most famous stories connected with the publication of the novel. We have 3 steps: the crisis, the savior, and the result. Step 1 is the crisis. Goldsmith was in serious financial difficulty. He was struggling with debts, and the famous account of the episode describes him as being in distress and facing trouble with his landlady. Samuel Johnson later recalled going to Goldsmith during this crisis. Now imagine the situation. You have written a manuscript, but you have very little money. You are already under financial pressure, and suddenly you need money immediately. That was roughly the situation surrounding Goldsmith and his manuscript. Step 2 is the savior. The person who becomes important here is Dr. Samuel Johnson, one of the greatest literary figures of 18th century England and Goldsmith's close friend. Johnson helped Goldsmith by taking the manuscript and arranging its sale to the bookseller Francis Newbery. Historical records confirm that the manuscript was sold through Johnson's intervention, although the novel itself was not published until 1766. So we should remember the sequence. Goldsmith had the manuscript. Goldsmith was in financial difficulty. Samuel Johnson intervened. The manuscript was sold to Francis Newbery, and eventually the novel was published in 1766. There is one more important point here. The sale did not mean that the novel was immediately published. The manuscript had been sold several years before the eventual publication, and the exact reasons for the delay have been discussed by historians. One explanation is that the publisher was uncertain about the book's commercial prospects. Another connects the delay with Goldsmith's growing reputation after The Traveller. So do not memorize the story as simply, Johnson saved Goldsmith and immediately published the novel. That is too simplified. Instead, remember, Johnson helped Goldsmith financially by arranging the sale of the manuscript, and the novel was eventually published in 1766. And why is this publication story important? Because it gives us an extraordinary contrast. The author was struggling financially, yet the work he was trying to sell would become one of the most enduringly popular novels of the 18th century. That is the irony of literary history. A book that was once part of a desperate financial situation eventually became a classic. So, for your examination memory, keep 4 points together. Oliver Goldsmith. Only novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. Published, 1766. Publication associated with the intervention of Samuel Johnson and the bookseller Francis Newbery. And one final correction to the slide. Do not say that Goldsmith championed biblical morality, as though this were a simple Enlightenment versus Goldsmith opposition. It is safer and more accurate to say that the novel combines 18th century concerns about morality, sentiment, reason, social behavior, and human nature. With these foundations clear, we are now ready to enter the world of Dr. Charles Primrose, his family, and the remarkable series of fortunes and misfortunes that make up the Vicar of Wakefield. Now let us look at the chronology of Oliver Goldsmith's life. This slide is very important because if we know Goldsmith's life in chronological order, many of his works and experiences become much easier to remember. Think of this timeline as a journey. Goldsmith's life was not a straight and comfortable journey. It was full of education, poverty, travel, uncertainty, literary success, and finally fame. Let us begin at the first point. Goldsmith was born in Ireland, traditionally dated to 1728, although some sources give 1730 because the exact year is uncertain. The important examination point is not simply the date. Remember that Goldsmith was Irish-born, and he came from a family connected with the church. His father was an Anglican clergyman. This background is useful when we later study The Vicar of Wakefield because the central character, Dr. Charles Primrose, is also a clergyman. Now move to 1744 to 1749. Goldsmith attended Trinity College, Dublin. His university life was not particularly comfortable. He experienced financial difficulties and struggled socially and academically. There are also stories about his poverty and his writing of songs or ballads to earn money. These stories have become part of the traditional picture of Goldsmith as a gifted but financially troubled young man. So, if you see Goldsmith in an examination question, remember this contrast: great literary talent, but a difficult financial life. Next comes 1752 to 1756. This is the traveling period. Goldsmith traveled through Europe and spent time studying medicine, particularly at institutions including Edinburgh and Leiden. But his life during these years was extremely uncertain. He had very little money and often depended on his own talents and resourcefulness. One famous anecdote says that he played the flute in exchange for food or lodging while traveling. Whether every detail of such anecdotes can be historically verified is less important than the larger picture. Goldsmith experienced poverty and wandered through Europe before establishing himself as a professional writer. Now we come to 1756. This is a major turning point. Goldsmith arrived in London. This is extremely important because London was the centre of 18th century English literary and publishing life. But again, he did not immediately become famous. He worked in different capacities and struggled financially before gradually establishing himself as a writer. Then comes 1764. This is another major date. Goldsmith published The Traveller. The full title is The Traveller, or A Prospect of Society. This poem brought him considerable literary recognition. So remember, 1764, The Traveller. 2 years later comes the work we are studying. 1766, The Vicar of Wakefield. This is Goldsmith's only novel and his most famous prose fiction. So we have a very useful memory sequence: 1764, The Traveller, 1766, The Vicar of Wakefield. Then we move toward the final stage of his career. In 1773, Goldsmith's comedy She Stoops to Conquer was performed and became a major theatrical success. This is important because Goldsmith was not only a novelist and poet. He was also a successful dramatist. And finally, 1774. Goldsmith died in London on the 4th of April 1774, at the age of about 45. So look at the entire journey once again. Born in Ireland, studies at Trinity College, Dublin, travels through Europe, experiences poverty and uncertainty, arrives in London, publishes The Traveller in 1764, publishes The Vicar of Wakefield in 1766, achieves theatrical success with She Stoops to Conquer in 1773. Dies in 1774. Now let us connect this timeline directly with our novel. The Vicar of Wakefield was published when Goldsmith was already an established literary figure, but his own earlier experiences of poverty, travel, uncertainty, and social observation help us understand why his writing is so interested in human behavior and changing fortune. And there is a beautiful contrast here. Goldsmith's own life moved through repeated changes of fortune, and The Vicar of Wakefield also gives us a family whose life changes dramatically from security to suffering and eventually toward resolution. So do not learn this timeline as a collection of isolated dates. Learn it as a story. Ireland, Trinity College, European travels, London, The Traveller, The Vicar of Wakefield, She Stoops to Conquer, death in 1774. If you remember that sequence, you can reconstruct most of the important dates in an examination. And the 3 dates I especially want you to keep firmly in your memory for this course are 1764, The Traveller, 1766, The Vicar of Wakefield, 1773, She Stoops to Conquer. These 3 dates immediately connect Goldsmith with his major poetic, fictional, and dramatic achievements. Now let us come to a very important part of our introduction: Oliver Goldsmith's life as a professional writer. The title of this slide is Oliver Goldsmith, His Life and Works, and the subtitle is The Shift from Aristocratic Patrons to Booksellers. This idea is extremely important if we want to understand 18th century literature. To understand Goldsmith properly, we must first understand how a writer earned money during this period. Today, a writer may write a book, publish it, sell it online or through a publisher, and receive royalties. But in the 18th century, the literary marketplace was developing rapidly, and many writers depended on booksellers and publishers for their income. At the same time, the older system of aristocratic patronage was still important. A patron was a wealthy or influential person who supported a writer financially. So imagine a young writer who has talent but no money. Instead of depending entirely on book sales, he might seek the support of a wealthy patron. But Goldsmith's career also shows us the growing importance of the commercial literary marketplace. This brings us to the phrase, Grub Street. Now, do not misunderstand this as simply the name of a street. Grub Street was an actual street in London, but Grub Street gradually became a term associated with struggling, commercially employed writers who produced material for publishers and periodicals. A hack writer was essentially a writer who wrote for money, often producing work quickly according to what publishers or readers wanted. The word hack can sound insulting today, but for our examination, remember the economic meaning. Goldsmith had to write to survive. He produced reviews, essays, translations, histories, biographies, and other kinds of prose for the bookselling and publishing market. The University of Toronto describes him as finding success working for Grub Street booksellers as a versatile writer of reviews, histories, biographies, translations, and social commentary. So we can imagine two Goldsmiths. The first Goldsmith is the struggling professional writer who has to accept commercial work because he needs money. The second Goldsmith is the major literary artist who produces works that have survived for centuries. And this distinction is very important. Goldsmith did not begin his literary career by immediately writing only masterpieces. He wrote a great deal of practical, commercial material. Then, alongside this work, his literary reputation gradually developed. Now look at the central golden box on the slide. It is labeled, the pure gold. This is referring to the works for which Goldsmith is especially remembered as a major literary writer. Let us take them one by one. First, poetry. The Traveller was published in 1764. It is an important poem about society, human happiness, government, and different forms of national and social life. Then we have The Deserted Village, published in 1770. This poem deals with rural life, social change, displacement, poverty, and the loss of an idealized village community. So remember, The Traveller, 1764. The Deserted Village, 1770. Next, drama. Goldsmith wrote The Good-Natured Man, which was first performed in 1768. And then came She Stoops to Conquer, first performed in 1773. She Stoops to Conquer became one of his greatest theatrical successes. And finally, the work that is most important for our present course. The Vicar of Wakefield, published in 1766. This is Goldsmith's only novel. So if an examination asks, which is Oliver Goldsmith's only novel? The answer is immediately The Vicar of Wakefield. Now look at the bottom of the slide. It gives us a connection between Goldsmith's own life and George Primrose. This is an interesting comparison, but we must understand it carefully. George Primrose is one of Dr. Charles Primrose's sons in The Vicar of Wakefield. George goes to London hoping to make his fortune, but he does not understand the literary and commercial world very well, and his attempts to establish himself become unsuccessful. This can remind us of Goldsmith's own difficult early experiences in London. But we should not say that George Primrose is simply a direct autobiography of Goldsmith. That would be too strong. Instead, we can say that Goldsmith's personal experiences of poverty, uncertainty, London life, and literary struggle may help us appreciate the realism behind some of George's experiences. There is also another important correction to the slide. It says that Goldsmith plagiarized an 8-volume history of the Earth. For examination purposes, we should use more careful language. Goldsmith was commissioned to produce large-scale works of history and natural history, and his An History of the Earth, an animated nature eventually appeared in 8 volumes. It was a commercial work and was published posthumously in 1774. Goldsmith did sometimes rely heavily on earlier sources and compilations, which is part of the reason he is associated with the 18th century culture of commercial compilation. But simply teaching students, Goldsmith plagiarized the 8-volume history, is an oversimplification. The safer examination point is, Goldsmith was a prolific hack writer who produced commercial histories, translations, essays, and compilations, while also producing major literary works. And this makes Goldsmith particularly interesting. His career shows us the transition from the older world of literary patronage to the expanding commercial world of booksellers, publishers, and professional authors. He could write something simply because he needed to earn money, but he could also produce literature that survived far beyond its immediate commercial purpose. That is why the slide calls the major works pure gold. So, keep this simple progression in your mind. Goldsmith needed money. He worked for booksellers. He became associated with Grub Street and hack writing. He produced commercial prose, but alongside that commercial writing, he produced major literary works. And among those major works, The Vicar of Wakefield occupies a special position because it is his only novel. Now, as we continue, keep this background in mind. When we meet George Primrose struggling to establish himself in London, do not see him merely as a young character making mistakes. See him within the larger 18th century world of money, employment, booksellers, writers, social class, and literary ambition. That background will make the novel much easier to understand.